Go ahead and start it. I'll edit.
These. Welcome everybody to the Yoga Center of Chico's Yoga Philosophy Group. I'm Lauren Carley, and with me is Tom Hess, co-owner. In this series, we are studying the Bhagavad Gita and how it can relate to your life. We use the translation by Eknath Esfarwan, but you can use any translation you like. I'm honored to introduce our presenter, an owner of the Yoga Center, Tom Hess. Now.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you. Hi. Thanks, Lauren. I'm excited about this particular chapter in the Bhagavad Gita. It's the third chapter. It's titled Selfless Service or Karma Yoga. This particular chapter really embodies Krishna's instruction to Arjuna. Arjuna is in despair. He needs an answer from Krishna. He asks Krishna to help him. And he wants a simple answer. He doesn't want any complex things. So he starts off, Krishna starts off, or continuing from the second chapter, Krishna was telling Arjuna about the immortality of the soul, and that death is just a transition, it's not really an end of anything. So Krishna at this point is trying to tell Arjuna this deep philosophical concept, and Arjuna is like, no, I just want to know what to do. I just want to know what to do. Should I fight or not fight? Okay, so then Krishna understands he's going to have to back up his teachings a little bit. And he says, all right, Arjuna, you have two options for the dilemma that you're in. And let's be sure we understand what the goal is here. It's a spiritual wisdom, an understanding of the spiritual transformation of yoga. Okay, so Krishna tells Arjuna, all right, Arjuna, you have two options for the spiritual journey. You have the option of jnana yoga, or the yoga of meditation, or you have the option of karma yoga, the practice of selfless service. And these two practices are pretty delineated in two main texts. The selfless service aspect, which is we're studying now, is the Bhagavad Gita. But this whole idea of the jnana, or the yoga meditation, is really fleshed out quite extensively in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So I'm pretty sure after this whole year and a half that we studying the Bhagavad Gita, we're going to jump right into the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and that will enable us to compare and contrast these two styles of yoga: the meditative absorption yoga to try to still the fluctuations of consciousness, and the karma yoga, the yoga of service, or selfless service in this case. Again, Arjuna just wants a simple answer. He says, Krishna, which of the two are best? Okay, so Krishna tells them that for you, Arjuna, the karma yoga is the best solution because you're a man of action. Let's say that he was dealing with a contemplative man, a man of letters. Maybe he might give that answer to that individual the path of jnana yoga. But Arjuna, because he's a warrior, because that's the nature of his being, it's his dharma, right? That's going to be a big word that we're going to touch on very soon. Because of his dharma, he should be a man of action, therefore he should act. But the problem is the ego involvement in that act. As long as he acts selflessly, it's fine. When he acts with an expectation of benefit, or if he's averted, if he shies away from something, at the end of it, those acts then are not done selflessly. And that is when he starts to accumulate karma. Okay, let's back up a little bit and look at this. What is an act? Why do we have to act? Well, Arjuna to ask Krishna, well, why do I even have to do that? And Krishna tells Arjuna, hey, everybody that's born, everything is acting at all points in their life. You can be in a cave in the Himalayas and you're still acting, you're doing things, you're acting, moving, you're meditating, you're thinking, you're doing all kinds of things. So you can't get away with it. You can't get away with not acting in the world. And you know what that acting is? It's dharma. And what you need to do is within all of those acts, find what is your calling, what is your job on this earth, what is your gift. That's the dharma. So it's not enough just to act. You have to act within the context of your own dharma. And then within that dharma, as Krishna says sometimes, someplace else in the text, I think it was in the previous chapter, to do someone else's dharma is not is worse than doing no dharma at all, no act at all. So it's so important to find your own specific purpose and dharma, and then that will guide you towards your acts. But then, once you get into that acting mode of your dharma, there's another step. That step is not becoming attached to the results, not becoming attached to anything that might come to you or any problems. Or let's say you do something and it doesn't turn out well, you even disassociate yourself from that feeling of negativity. So that's the secret to this selfless service. We need to not be attached to the results. Okay. There's another important idea in this area of the text. We've talked about it before, and we've defined it before, but it's really important in this chapter, and that's the idea of karma. Karma is the law of cause and effect that permeates the world. Every action has a previous action that led to it. For the most part, you'll see a couple of examples as we go forward. That's not true in every case, but in most of the cases, an action gives you a reaction. Okay. This is the basic belief that all religions have. And it's this whole concept that you reap what you sow. The things that you put out in the world are the things that come back to you in the world. So this is where Krishna encourages Arjuna to do your action, but in doing your action, set an example for humanity that you do your duties, you do what you need to be done, and that should be an example for the people around you who see you, who idolatrize you, who really like you, and so that they can do that same thing. Basically, Krishna is asking Arjuna to set an example by serving the welfare of the world around you. So this ties into this whole idea of karma. All of your actions, you want to do so they don't accumulate karma. Because what happens is this, okay, you do an action, you get a result. And you're attached to that result, whether it be good or a bad result. Those things that leave an impression on you. That impression is this karma. And that's what then leads to the next action or reaction from that. Okay, so just imagine if you do an act and you don't get any attachment or pleasure or aversion from it, and you're not attached to the result, you don't accumulate that karma. In the spiritual terms, karma is bondage. It's attaching you to a previous act in furtherance of an act after that. If you stop that idea, you don't accumulate this karma. And the thing of it is this karma is what takes you from life to life to life. If I'm a spiritual practitioner and I live, let's say, 20 lives or 5,000 lives, who knows? And my goal in each of those lives is to not accumulate this karma in my being. And it takes me that long. It takes me as long as it does, as many lifetimes. But at the end of those lifetimes, the next life I'm born into, I'm free of that karmic imprint. I'm free of those impressions, so that I no longer have to be reborn again. I can then be self-realized, self-illumined. So that's the way of selfless service, karma, and that's how to get there. You go through your life not accumulating karma. But all of that is based on you not being attracted or rejecting the results of your actions. Once you do an act, you must let it go. It's done with that. People act for their own pleasure and pain. They very seldom act unselfishly to the world. This is where the ego comes in. We must act selflessly without the influence of the ego. The ego is the one that steps in there and starts to make it about me rather than about my service to others. So this is another way to sort of alleviate these pressures of the ego. The ignorant work for their own profit. The wise work for the profit of others. Okay, so he gets back into this whole idea of jnana yoga again, and how this meditative state of jnana yoga can lead one to understanding their true self, and then understanding the true self is self-realization. So these are two paths of yoga where the destination is the same. The means to get there are different. Karma yoga, the practice of selfless service, service to humanity, not for the ego. Jnana yoga, the practice of meditative contemplation, both of them should lead to this position of self-understanding, self-realization. And the goals are same. It's just a different take on it and a different set of practices that one wants to know themselves and know themselves enough to make the right decision. Clearly, Arjuna is a man of action. He needs to do karma. A meditator, there's a man of contemplation. They should do the meditation. So it really has to do with the individual. And each of these steps along the way are ways that we understand and see clearly our own selves in the world. Okay, so that's the comparison between the two. Okay, then Arjuna asks Krishna, okay, I understand that I have to act selflessly. What gets in the way? What makes me make the wrong decision even though I might know it's wrong? Okay, this comes down to two elements, anger and selfish desires. We have to talk a little bit about the gunas here and the gunas. Now, these are some of the words that Warren and I encourage you to learn at the very beginning, the definitions of the words. And I totally understand if you don't know them right now, but refer to them. Look up the word guna. Guna is a very important concept in this whole thing because it describes a transformational tool. Okay, so the gunas are based on Samkhya philosophy. Samkhya philosophy is one of the 6 philosophical schools of yoga, schools of philosophical thought in India. And Samkhya is the category that yoga falls under, Samkhya yoga. Okay, so one of the main ideas in Samkhya yoga are this idea of the gunas. And there are 3 of them, tamas, rajas, and sattva. And tamas means lethargy or stagnation or heaviness. Rajas means activity, movement, action. Sattva is a state of illumination that we all really seek. It's a contentment, it's an understanding, it's being all right with yourself. So how do we transform our lives from tamas to sattva? Okay, the way that we do it is through rajas. Rajas is activity. We need to implement it to our mental fortitude, our mental discipline, to bring about this transformation from a state of tamasic lethargy to sattvic illumination. Okay. Where do the selfless desire and anger come in? They come in rajas. So in the transformational journey from tamas to sattva, we go through action. As we are going through this action or practice or development in our spiritual life, we run into selfish desire and anger. And this selfish desire and anger are the pitfalls, and they are what you need to keep a close eye on as you travel, because they're instigated by the ego, the desire of the ego, because the ego says I'm right, and if somebody else is right, I get angry because they're right. Selfish desire is easy. I like something, I have a selfish desire for it, even if I don't deserve it, even if it's not really what I should be doing at this point in my life. So these are aspects of the rajas element within us that we need to look and overcome to get to that sattvic state of being. They're the pitfalls. If we cannot reach the state of detachment or selfless service, we will continually be subject to the whims of the gunas. We will always be fluctuating between tamas, rajas, and sattva. And if, depending on our spiritual development, we might be stuck in the tamasic state for a long period of time, or not have enough rajas to pull us out of the hole of tamas. So we want to overcome this and get beyond this. Okay, one of the, I think, very important things he mentions towards the latter part of the chapter, and he doesn't use the word, but he describes them. They're the 5 koshas, and they are, he talks about them in the sense of body, senses, mind, intellect, and atma. And that correlates to the koshas that we study in the yoga practice. Annamaya kosha, pranamaya kosha, manomaya kosha, vijnanamaya kosha, and anandamaya kosha. These are the 5 layers. So he brings them up in the latter part of this chapter, and he hierarchies them. He gives them a hierarchy. So the senses have more importance than the body. The mind has more importance than the senses. The intellect has more importance than the mind. Atman, the true self within you, has more importance than all of them. So the reason he brings this up at this point is he's telling Krishna to do his work from the stance of the Atma, that true self within, not be concerned with body, senses, mind, or intellect. His actions, thoughts should be instigated by that illumined self within the Atma. So basically what Arjuna's task is now, and our task as spiritual seekers, is to look at our acts, do our acts without attachment to the result, and do those acts from that true self within us, that Atma. If we can live our lives like this, we can then start to not accumulate this karma, this bondage that we take from life to life. And it will lead to a very light existence, a light life. That's the chapter on selfless service. Thank you. And I look forward to continuing this ongoing discussion. Laura?
Okay, I just turned you off. All right, we should be good with the other speaker now. Thank you, Tom. So now we're going to spend a little time talking about the practices, some suggested practices that you can do regarding this chapter. So a brief, big overall recap. We started by identifying the war within. And right there, as soon as we started identifying the war within, I would submit that we raised our conscience a little bit about our condition in life. And then in the next chapter, Krishna is telling Arjuna about the eternal self, the part that goes beyond the body, the part of us that is associated with the greater Brahman, or you might say with Purusha. And then now we're coming into chapter 3, which Tom just did a great job of walking us through. So we're focused here on some practices. There's a lot more practices you can do, but here's 5 or 6 that we're suggesting. First, I want to say that this chapter, from my perspective, is about the 5th limb of yoga, and that's a reference to the 8 limbs of yoga that Tom mentioned come up in the Yoga Sutras. That's pratyahara, where the practice is to bring the senses under control. It's another way of saying what Tom was just saying, what Krishna was just saying to Arjuna, but I would encourage you to think about Krishna saying that to you personally. Bringing the senses under control. But the task at hand from the Gita is twofold and then twofold again. And let me explain that. The first twofold is what the task at hand. The task at hand is to detach, live in the world, but detach from it. And then, of course, the second part of the action is the selfless service. You could do the two together, but I like to see them for the sake of staying sane as 2 separate things to practice. And then the second twofold part is how you apply your consciousness to what it is that you're doing. So let's get into it. One of the practices could be that at any point in time, when you find yourself perhaps doing something that may or may not be in control, you could just simply stop and ask yourself, is this a conscious decision or is it a reaction? Am I reacting as if I'm following the fever of the ego? Fever of the ego, that's a term, at least in the version that we're using, that comes from page 108, and it is Krishna warning Arjuna about the fever of the ego. So the practice, super simple. Any point in time you find yourself, say, reaching for something, doing something, thinking something that maybe isn't quite good, ask yourself, is this a reaction or is this a conscious decision to act? That's starting the process of detachment and lifting the consciousness up to look down on what is going on. Now you're seeing yourself on the stage of action. The second practice, we introduced earlier in a previous session the model, and it's just a model of the behavior chain. You can go back into the documents we've been sending out and find that model. You can use that model to slow the action down and thus, as Tom was suggesting, start to intervene. Let me break it down further. The beginning of the behavior chain starts with a trigger. Something triggers you, something that you're watching, you're looking at, you're thinking, you're feeling, you're smelling, you're hearing, the senses, starts a process. If you can raise your level of consciousness to start recognizing those triggers, now you're getting someplace. A trigger results in a thought, words that you're hearing in your mind. And quite often that thought is the ego voice coming through. the ego voice saying something like, go ahead, or you should do this, or you shouldn't do this, that usually it's a demanding kind of unrelenting situation. But you can talk back to the ego and you can look at what's going on with that trigger that triggered those words and look at it objectively. As you'll find in other documents, they'll say, you're not detaching from this. You're still feeling everything that goes on, but you're looking at it objectively. You're watching what's going on. That's part of the Atman coming through. From the trigger to the words to the thoughts, the words trigger the emotions. And there's the hook. There's the net that we get caught up in, is the emotions. But again, you can feel elation, you can feel depression, you can feel every range of motion in between, but you can also raise your level of consciousness to look at what's going on and say, yes, I choose to feel that emotion, and that's what's going on. I understand that that was triggered, and the emotion leads to an action. And that's exactly what we're talking about here with the first part, which is to start really looking at your actions. You know, is it a reaction? Am I just reacting, or am I making a conscious decision? And then with the practice of detachment, some people say unattachment. I'm not here to argue the English, but with the practice of looking at this objectively, then you really can start practicing selfless service, because you are now detached from the process, but you're still acting in and living the process. And so you can come out the other end with whatever action you take towards somebody that is broken that karmic bond. And I'll say from my own experience, once you start feeling some of those detachments and those non-karmic actions, you feel a sense of relief. It's, you feel at peace. There is definitely something, at least that I can only speak for myself, but that you feel at the end. You know when you've been through that. The fourth practice, so the third practice, raise your level of consciousness about the above practices. I rolled all that in. But the fourth practice is use your asana practice to look at yourself objectively. Use your pranayama practice to look at yourself objectively. That's what a lot of those practices do. They can be seen as tools to start practicing the objective looking at yourself, hearing the words in your mind, feeling the emotions, taking the action. And just to emphasize that point from page 109, Krishna says, let the Atman rule the ego. Same thing that Tom said, but here's a practice we can do to try to detach from the ego and let the Atman shine through. And of course, the obvious fifth practice is to actually practice selfless service. And what Krishna says is use these senses that we've been talking about, the hearing, the taste, the sight, etc. Use them for selfless service. I would say step off the karmic hamster wheel and out of the distractions of the karmic rat race. Those are just Lawrence terms. And step into the endless flow of Brahman. Now that is coming from page 106 in this same chapter, where Krishna says, every act of selfless service is born from Brahman, the eternal. Brahman is present in every act of service. All life turns on this law. All life turns on this law. If that isn't a powerful statement, I don't know what is. But that is an example of what happens when you start practicing this detachment, raising your level of consciousness, practicing selfless service. It becomes almost automatic. You're not thinking, oh, I just score one for me. I just did something that was selfless service. I'm going to try and do 2 every day or something along that line. You step off of that karmic rat race hamster wheel that's just driving you day to day to put one foot in front of the other, and you step off of it into the flow of Brahman. So those are the practices that we suggest. Tom sent them out in an email if you didn't catch the email, and then we'll be sending them out in a follow-up email with the documents that we provide to everybody in this group. And with that, Tom, I'll turn it back to you for any last comments.
Well, thank you, Lauren. No real comments, just I appreciate the practices that you described, and this is important. This is a book, these are just words. You want to be able to implement some of the important ideas in your life, and these practices that Lauren described are the way to do it. So, thank you, keep practicing, keep serving. Take care, bye-bye.